I've often heard Herbert Spencer's phrase survival of the fittest used to describe evolution by means of natural selection. Among those who are comfortable and capable with the topic, it rarely comes up as it's somewhat oversimplified and misleading, but when it does, it causes no real confusion as all parties know what is meant by the term fittest, i.e. organisms possessing certain genotypic characteristics that make them better adjusted to an environment tend to survive, reproduce, increase in number or frequency, and therefore are able to transmit and perpetuate their essential genotypic qualities to succeeding generations. In other words, it's shorthand for natural selection. However, it's constantly misrepresented as survival of those who are in the best physical shape, which is a tautology, or sometimes people will even say it provides a justification for morally corrosive behaviours.
Charles Darwin could never have imagined such a plan, but here at Wannsee, the Nazis took his survival of the fittest, his theory about the diversity and complexity of life on the planet, and crunched it down as the motor behind one of the most evil ideas of our times.
This clip is from a BBC documentary. I've used the clip not because it best demonstrates my point, although I think it does, but rather to show that people who should know better often make this mistake as well. The commentator calls it Darwin's survival of the fittest. This is an obvious mistake as the term belongs to Herbert Spencer, but then he makes a second mistake of claiming the Nazis twisted and used the idea to their own ends. This is absolute nonsense, as the very idea of common descent is incompatible with the idea of a master race. If anything, it shows the opposite and shows how interconnected we all are. In truth, the Nazi ideology is far closer to a form of Lamarckism, albeit a twisted one. Now, as for Darwin's view on the strongest or smartest being the ones that survive, well, I think we should allow him to speak for himself. Charles Darwin: it is not the strongest species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the ones most responsive to change. However, even with the latter denoted, the mistake still seems to perpetuate and linger. The mistake tends to be perpetuated by two groups: some people who are just unfortunately misinformed, and the second group of whack-job creationists looking to rationalise their insanity. This video is directed at the first group, so hopefully we can clear up some misapprehensions they may be operating under. Needless to say, this term is no longer used by biologists or people in related fields due to the constant misinterpretation, but the misinterpretation seems to have stuck and given many a skewed and warped view of what natural selection is and what it entails. They seem to have drawn the conclusion that natural selection is a warped form of individual selection. In many cases they simply think of big and strong as quote-unquote fit, and completely forget the environment and context in which the organism operates. In other words, they look for the Mike Tyson of the ant or parrot world and think that he will be selected for in all cases regardless of environmental conditions. This is obviously wrong. For example, imagine for a moment that you're a paleontologist and you happen to find 4 skulls, 2 male and 2 female. One pair is highly sexually dimorphic, or in other words, the male skull is a lot bigger than the female. Well, you know you've probably found 2 members of a tournament species. The second shows low sexual dimorphism. In other words, the male and female skulls are approximately the same size, so you can guess that you've probably found 2 members of a pair bonding species. Now, what could you tell about the types of selection pressures being applied to the 2 species, and what behaviours would you expect to be selected for? If we ask ourselves 1 or 2 questions based on what we already know, the answers become apparent rather easily. So what do we know? Well, we know that males from tournament species are rather large compared to females, and males from pair bonding species are of a similar size to females. So, in which species would we expect to see more male aggression? Obviously enough, it's the tournament species, as they're physically equipped to fight, whereas our little parrots are not so well equipped to the task. How do we expect the distribution of children to males or reproductive access to go in each species? Well, in a tournament species, we'd expect the big alphas to dominate and have loads of children, and that's exactly what we see, with 5% of males accounting for 95% of the children. And in a pair bonding species, we would expect to see 1 or 2 children per male, and again, that's exactly what we see in pair bonding species. So, what would the females of both species be looking for in their males? Well, in a pair bonding species, obviously enough, they're looking for parental behaviour, as the male is going to stick around and be a nice guy and help them with the kids. And obviously enough, in the tournament species, the female just wants a big, strong male, as all she's ultimately getting from him is his sperm. So how would the males from each species display that they are the right male for the job? Well, in a pair bonding species they would court, i.e. they would bring food and show that they are capable of providing for children, whereas in the tournament species the males would display aggression and dominance over other males. In other words, given the selection pressures in their environment, they would show that they're a big, strong male, capable of taking care of themselves, and as such, given the selection pressures, they're the best male to have children with. What can we say about life expectancy? Well, obviously enough, males in a tournament species don't live as long as females. They spend an awful lot of time fighting with each other, and as such they accrue a lot of injuries throughout the years. Needless to say, old age is not so kind to a species in such a violent environment, whereas males from a pair bond species tend to live approximately the same length of time as females. The point is straightforward enough. If the term survival of the fittest is used and the word fit is defined as big and strong, selfish or physically fit, or any number of other traits along these lines, then one is in trouble immediately, as you cannot account for a large number of species who live in an environment that selects for completely different things, both in terms of morphology and even behaviour. Put even simpler again, biology can't be interpreted outside the context of environment. Just to be clear, the pair bond versus tournament species is a single example. There are multiple exceptions with lots of variation given the different selection pressures on organisms in different environments. One fairly easy and straightforward example is our own species. If you look at human beings, you'll find traits from both tournament and pair bond species. Now, getting back to the idea of survival of the fittest, the pair bond versus tournament species should have poked some holes in it already, but people who use the term survival of the fittest often have trouble understanding how selection pressure actually works, in particular areas such as cooperation and how they could have arisen within a species. So we'll just run a little thought exercise to see how a trait such as cooperation could have arisen. Here's the scenario. A biogeographic event separates a species. Most of the species stays in area A, but a small number is moved to area B. Over successive generations, the smaller group becomes more closely related due to its small numbers. Kin selection takes over in the small group and related creatures cooperate. However, the trait of cooperation is being selected for in the group as a whole, as it offers a greater payoff to second and third cousins, etc. if they cooperate. Over a short period, you'll have a fairly cooperative little group. Now, the biogeographic event is reversed and the smaller group is now reintroduced to the larger one. The scenario now looks like this. You have a large group of competing creatures and you have a small nucleus within that group that cooperates. To understand what happens next, we'll need to look at a species that has some variation in the trait that we're looking at, i.e. cooperation. Let's take chickens. We'll take a super aggressive female chicken and a passive female chicken. We'll call the aggressive one A and the passive one B. Obviously enough, the aggressive chicken will dominate the food supply and anything else that she can, and thus become a better layer than the passive one. Now let's take a group of high aggressive females and a group of passive females and put them together. Well, what happens? The aggressive females injure and harass each other and lower their fertility rates, with the result being that passive females outcompete them fairly easily. In other words, a single A or aggressive chicken can outcompete a single passive chicken, but groups of passive chickens can outcompete groups of aggressive chickens, and we get a form of group selection. Now back to our divided and reintroduced species. We have a group of competing creatures with a small nucleus that cooperates. Well, given what we've just discussed, the small group will outcompete the larger group, forcing cooperation to crystallize outwards into the rest of the group. This is called a founder effect. In other words, the trait moves faster in the smaller population due to its size, and when they're introduced back into the mainstream population, it outcompetes it fairly easily and spreads through the population. When the trait moves back into the larger group, it moves from being a kin selection phenomenon to a reciprocal altruism phenomenon. So once again, when we talk about survival of the fittest, which is really just a skewed form of individual selection, this initial jump towards cooperation is difficult to explain as it's easily punished. However, if we broaden the span of selection pressures and we look at kin selection, we can see a way for this trait to be jump-started and ultimately have a founder effect on the rest of the population. Now, to move away from thought exercises to something more solid and tangible, which will hopefully show that survival of the fittest in its improper form cannot and does not explain a wealth of behaviour that we see. Two examples, bats and ants. So, as everybody knows, vampire bats drink blood and they fill up a big throat sac that they have. But the females in this species, they operate on a reciprocal altruistic system. They share with all the other kids in the nest. So what happens if a bat cheats? Well, we've tested this and know what happens. You take a syringe and you pump up the throat sac of a female bat with air, and then you just shove her back in the nest. Well, all the other females look and they can see, oh, she's got loads of blood and she's not sharing. Well, next round, they don't feed her kids. When they go and get blood, they don't help her. In other words, they're positively selecting for a reciprocal altruistic trait, whilst at the same time actively punishing less cooperative traits. Survival of the fittest cannot explain this behaviour. If this trait is interpreted outside environment, it makes no sense. Now for one of my favourite creatures, the ant. Many ants are blind, and as such they use a form of chemical signalling to communicate. When an ant patrol finds food, it reports back to the nest, but they don't all just arrive back at the same time. The sequence that the patrol arrives back in is what communicates the success or failure of their ant mission. In other words, being the biggest, strongest and fastest wouldn't do you much good, as working in unison is how ants communicate. If an ant couldn't work in unison, he may screw up the message, and as such, ants that worked better together were better at communicating and ultimately finding and harvesting food. Just as a side note for the other ant lovers who may be watching this, if you're interested in seeing the experiments that show the ants communicating via sequence and not just all coming back and releasing the hormones necessary, you might want to grab the History Channel series Evolve, because they have a load of really good experiments and really clever experiments that show how all this works. Now, ceasing to digress and back on track, the behaviour of the ants once again demonstrates that the survival of the fittest doesn't really explain their behaviour at all. The only way the behaviour can be explained is within the context of environment. Survival of the fittest should be avoided in general, as it has poor descriptive power, but when it comes up, the term fit has to be called into question and defined. As stated earlier, fit means organisms possessing certain genotypic characteristics that make them better adjusted to an environment, tend to survive, reproduce, increase in number or frequency, and therefore are able to transmit and perpetuate their essential genotypic qualities to succeeding generations. It doesn't mean big, strong or selfish. It may mean big, strong and selfish, but only relative to the environment. So, survival of the fittest. Well, not quite. And if you're one of those folks who uses the term survival of the fittest as shorthand for evolution by means of natural selection, you may wish to consider removing it from your vocabulary, or at least being very specific about the term fit. Thanks for watching.